Please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Picking up on where Mr. Barrett left off with respect to the sub-amendment, it is important that we hear from Don Guy and Brian Topp for the reasons mentioned by Mr. Barrett. But I think it's important to reflect on how we got here in the first place, why the need to bring forward this sub-amendment came about. And it came about because every single day there seems to be more corruption, more conflict, and more scandal with arguably the most rotten and corrupt government in modern Canadian history, if not Canadian history. We have a Prime Minister who, unlike any Prime Minister in Canadian history, has been found guilty not once, but twice of breaking Canada's ethics laws. He was found guilty of being in conflicts of interest. And so, given that leadership starts at the top and the culture of a government starts at the top, it's no wonder that we have seen the kind of rot and corruption that has permeated throughout this entire Liberal government. And we now know that carbon tax Carney has become conflict Carney when the Prime Minister shamelessly appointed his rich pal Carney to serve as the so-called chair of the Liberal Party's task force on economic growth. This is very convenient for the Prime Minister to appoint Mr. Carney chair of the Liberal Party's task force when in fact he essentially is advising the Prime Minister on matters of economic policy, and that is to avoid Mr. Carney being subject to the Conflict of Interest Act and to avoid having to make disclosures pursuant to that act with respect to his many conflicts. Now, what are some of those conflicts? Well, every day we seem to learn of new conflicts. And by the way, the title is Chair of the Liberal Party's Task Force. Guess what? We found out that it is a one-person task force, namely Carbon Tax Carney, also known as Conflict Carney. And speaking of those conflicts, almost immediately following his appointment as the Prime Minister's advisor, evidently the Prime Minister's lost confidence in his utterly incompetent Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, and we find out that the government raises the threshold for insured mortgages from $1 million to $1.5 million. Now, what is the significance of that? Well, it just so happens that Carbon Tax Carney, also known as Conflict of Interest Carney, is the chair of none other than Brookfield. Now, what is Brookfield? It is a multinational investment management company that owns Sagen, the second largest mortgage insurer. So think about that. You have an advisor to the Prime Minister on economic policy who then, upon his appointment, the government just out of coincidence raises the threshold for insured mortgages, and that advisor just happens to be the chair of Brookfield, the owner of the second largest mortgage insurer. And of course, it resulted in Brookfield benefiting richly from that decision. In fact, their stock hit a 6-month high.
How convenient.
How convenient. But that's just scratching the surface of the conflicts, because shortly after that, Carbon Tax Carney, at Conflict of Interest Carney's close friend, who serves as CEO of Telesat, received $2.14 billion in taxpayer loans. That's interesting. And then we find out that carbon tax Carney, also known as conflict of interest Carney, is negotiating with the very government that he's supposedly advising. Well, according to the Prime Minister, he's not advising the government. He's not advising the Prime Minister. He's somehow just advising the Liberal Party. But everyone knows he's advising the government. He's advising the Prime Minister. He is the de facto finance minister. And then we find out that he's negotiating with the very same government to do what? To shake down taxpayers, asking for $10 billion in funds for Brookfield. Conflict after conflict after conflict. And what is as bad is how arrogant this Prime Minister and carbon tax conflict of interest Carney have been to try to masquerade as an advisor to the Liberal Party, hoping that, or thinking that Canadians would be fooled by that. But of course, Canadians aren't fooled by that.
No chance.
It is very plain for the eye to see. It is brazen, blatant corruption and conflict. Conflict and corruption out in the open. After 9 years of this rotten, corrupt Prime Minister, they don't even try to hide the conflicts and the corruption.
They can't. In plain sight.
They can't. It's in plain sight. And so on that basis, we moved a motion to hear from carbon tax Carney, conflict of interest Carney, before this committee. It's an appropriate committee. It's the Ethics Committee. It is a committee that deals with matters of conflicts of interest to provide oversight to see that the Conflict of Interest Act is being enforced, and to hold to account those who have breached the act or have engaged in otherwise unethical activities, who are public office holders or ministers or other officials in this government. And I tell you, this committee is very, very busy because of all the work that this government has given it. And I would like to hear, and I think it's important for this committee to scrutinize Mr. Carney, to ask him about how it is that the threshold for insured mortgages was raised almost immediately after he was appointed advisor to the Prime Minister. Advisor to the Liberal Party, not when he is the chair of Brookfield, to answer for the fact that his close friend just happened to get $2 billion from the same government, again, just after he was appointed as economic advisor, and to explain how it is that he is, on the one hand, advising the Prime Minister and then negotiating, asking for $10 billion in funds for taxpayers for none other than Brookfield. It is about as rotten as it gets, shameless, out in the open, totally shameless. So, what do the Liberals do? When we bring forward a motion, it's what they always do. Mm-hmm. They scramble, they huddle, they wait for their talking points from the Prime Minister's office, and then they come in and they do everything that they can to shield the Prime Minister and his friends, including Mr. Carney, from accountability and from scrutiny. So they bring forward an amendment that they thought was rather clever to try to divert attention. They said, let's bring in Jenny Byrne. Well, why Jenny Byrne? She's not a federal lobbyist.
Nope.
Her firm doesn't do any federal lobbying.
Right.
But they want to hear from Ms. Byrne. Well, I don't have a problem. I don't think Mr. Barrett, Mr. Caputo, we don't have a problem.
Right.
I don't think Ms. Byrne has a problem.
I'm sure not.
I think the Liberals will run out of questions very quickly. But maybe not. But we'll hear from her if that's what they want to do. But if Ms. Byrne is going to be called to appear, then it is appropriate that we hear from Gurtan Singh, given the fact that he is the brother of the NDP leader, an advisor to the NDP leader, a former MPP, and a lobbyist for none other than Metro. I mean, the NDP and the Liberals like to talk about laws. Well, that's fine, but we can also hear from a lobbyist for Metro who just happens to be an advisor and brother to the leader of the NDP. And then there's Don Guy. Don Guy, who just weeks ago was meeting behind closed doors at the Liberals' Nanaimo caucus retreat, standing, or certainly in the same room with the captain of the Titanic himself, the Prime Minister. And he was, as the Canadian press reported, called in to give insights on how to mount a comeback. And boy, do they have a lot of work to do, so I can't imagine what the advice would be other than to maybe tell the Prime Minister to take a hike. But in any event, Don Guy is someone who happens to be an advisor to the Liberals, to the Prime Minister. He was there behind closed doors. He happens to be also the founding partner of GT, which, unlike Ms. Byrne's firm, does extensive federal lobbying, and doesn't just do extensive federal lobbying on anything, but is a lobbyist for Loblaws and Canada Bread Company, which, as Mr. Barrett noted, has pled guilty to price fixing.
Price fixing.
That's Don Guy. That's the Liberal Party advisor, Don Guy, who employs Julie DeWolf, the former director of caucus services and operations at the Liberal Research Bureau, and the same Don Guy, who is the owner and chief strategist of Polera, who employs Dan Arnold, the Liberals' pollster. And I think that's another interesting connection. And Don Guy was also there advising the Prime Minister's ski buddy, the fake rapporteur, David Johnson, in his sham investigation into foreign interference and the Prime Minister's efforts to cover up Beijing's attack on our democracy in the 2019 and 2021 elections, which benefited the Liberal Party, as determined not just by, that's not just me saying it, Madam Justice Hogue concluded that Beijing's interference may have materially impacted the results in certain ridings, including Steveston, Richmond East, in which my colleague Kenny Chu was defeated as a consequence of disinformation spread by Beijing that was amplified by the Liberal Party and Justin Trudeau. So, in short, Mr. Chair, this is a very reasonable amendment. We're happy to hear from Ms. Byrne, but there is if Ms. Byrne is going to be invited, there are far stronger and more compelling grounds to invite other witnesses like Mr. Singh, like Mr. Guy, and like Mr. Guy's business partner, former NDP Chief of Staff, Brian Topp. Let's hear from all of them. Let's have them for 2 hours. There's an objection about having 1 hour for Mr. Singh, 1 hour for Ms. Byrne. Let's have them here for 2 hours. But really the most important person we need to hear from is Mr. Carney. He needs to come to committee and he needs to answer for all of his conflicts and to answer questions about exactly what his role is within this government and why he is seeking to shield himself from scrutiny and shield himself from having to disclose his many conflicts. So I may have more to say, but I will leave it at that for now, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Barrett.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and let me just say that I find it very interesting that every time the question has been posed in the House, I believe by Mr. Barrett more than once, as to whether the Prime Minister ran his appointment of Mr. Carney as an advisor to the supposedly to the Liberal Party, if he ran that past the lobbying commissioner. The refusal of the Prime Minister and ministers in his government to answer such a straightforward question provides the answer to that question, and that is that he didn't run Mr. Carney by the lobbying commissioner, presumably because he would not have liked the answer from the lobbying commissioner. It is almost a certainty that it would not have been given the green light. It wouldn't have been given the green light because what the Prime Minister and Mark Carney, carbon tax Carney, conflict of interest Carney, have done is set up an arrangement that at the end of the day is the antithesis of open and accountable government, which is what the Prime Minister touted himself as championing upon being elected as Prime Minister. It is the antithesis of, I think, the standard that Canadians would expect, that someone who is advising the Prime Minister, not just anyone, we're talking about the former governor of the Bank of Canada, we're talking about the former governor of the Bank of England, someone advising the Prime Minister on economic policy, on other matters, ought to be subject to the Conflict of Interest Act and ought to have their conflicts disclosed. And the fact that the Prime Minister has very conveniently shielded carbon tax Carney, conflict of interest Carney from that is problematic. And so it's why we do need to hear from him. And I guess I understand why the Liberals are blocking our efforts, why they want to change the channel, because they want to talk about anything other than the conflicts of interest and corruption that surround Mr. Carney. But as Mr. Caputo noted, literally right now the entire House agenda of the House of Commons is been sidelined because of all of the corruption and scandals involving this government, not only involving Mr. Carney, but their obstruction of a clear and unambiguous order of the House to turn over all documents relating to the billion-dollar green slush fund, a scandal that occurred as a result, or occurred under the watch of the Minister of Industry, a scandal that the Deputy Minister compared in a secret audio recording as the largest scandal since the sponsorship scandal, and now another scandal, another finding of a prima facie question of privilege involving the shady business partner of the minister from Edmonton, the Minister of Employment, Randy Boissonneau, and his business partner coming to committee and telling the committee that the Randy in the text messages implicated in a $500,000 shakedown was some other Randy, but very conveniently, when he was ordered by this committee to identify that Randy, he refused to do so because everyone knows the Randy in the text messages, the Randy involved in the $500,000 shakedown, the Randy involved.
I feel like I've seen this movie before, so I don't think it's on the sub-amendment.
Yeah, we're gonna move back to the sub-amendment if we can, Mr. Cooper,
My
please.
point, Mr. Chair, is that it provides some context to the fact that it's not just Mr. Carney. As serious as that is, we're dealing with a government that, as I said in my earlier submissions, is arguably the most corrupt government in modern Canadian history, if not Canadian history.